I came to London to work, and it just took over me. I'm basically working here now, married, kid, having a great time. We run a food business, a pie business. We run a publishing business. We run a political consulting business, an economics consulting business, and an asset management business. I first came here in '96. I left Sydney in '92 to go to Hong Kong to work, and I was transferred here. So initially I was here working for a big bank, and for the first couple of years. But I have dual citizenship, so my other citizenship is Irish, so it was quite easy for me to reside here. It didn't have any implications. My decision to come to London was initially, there were two decisions, I guess, really. The first decision was to come in the first place, and that was a work decision. I was asked to come to London to do a job. So you either say yes or no, and you do it. At that same time, I had met my future wife. We weren't married at that time, but she's American, but she had lived in London as well. So she was keen to move back to London as well. So I thought, why not? Yeah, we'll go for a couple of years, and if it works out, it works out. We'll see what happens. And so that I sort of fell into it, if you like, in the first one. When I got here, it was great. You know, we were really enjoying what London had to offer, and it has an enormous amount to offer, and it's just got better and better and better as far as I can tell. I mean, there's obvious drawbacks, and we can come to them later, but at least superficially, it's a terrific place to live. I think that negativity here is, I think it's improving. I think it was, when I first came here 20-something years ago, just for a week, it was very negative. Everything was grey. The food was grey, the people were grey, the clouds were grey. And there wasn't that much to get excited about. And this was, I guess, just before Thatcher kind of kicked in. And Thatcher did make a huge difference. You can criticise, doesn't matter, it changed enormously. So I think people really were under the weather for 20 years. Maybe it was the Second World War or after that or whatever, but it was pretty horrible. I think now, particularly I live in London as opposed to living outside London. London is like New York. New York is not part of America in that sense. It's a completely different place. London is a completely different place to England. It's if you at any dinner party or pub or whatever, there's just like 10 people from 10 different parts of the world who are living and working in this city. That probably doesn't happen outside London. It might happen in some of the big centres, but in England or in London now, you don't see this negativity so much because you don't meet that many English people anymore. I don't know where they're gone. Maybe they're all gone to Australia. But it's astonishing. It really is amazing. So it's becoming much less noticeable. And I think it's because there's been prosperity. If you've got prosperity, if you've got a job, your family's pretty happy, then typically people are more upbeat. There are tons of positives for living here. Yeah, absolutely. I think there's loads of positives. And I'm talking from my experience. I was never a backpacker here, so I can't really talk from a vacation in that sense point of view, or extended vacation. But from a professional point of view, there are a number of centres of the universe for financial markets, and they ebb and wane a bit. New York is either on top of the heap, followed by London, or vice versa, or whatever. London seems to be on top at the moment. If it comes second, it doesn't matter. It's amazing, and it's a privilege to be able to work in the centre of what's going on. It's a great time zone. It's very convenient in that sense. It's great to be able to deal with Asia and deal with the States. In the States is inconvenient as a time zone as Australia is inconvenient as a time zone. It's exactly. I've tried to make phone calls to Australia from New York. It's impossible. You've got like an hour, and if it doesn't happen, then you've lost 24 hours. So from a professional point of view, living and working here is great. It's absolutely fantastic. The cultural identifiers, I think you can talk about two streams. One is culture, if you like, and the other is professional. And that's not to say that they're mutually exclusive, but there are two kind of distinct ways of looking at it. On the professional side, I am astonished at the number of Australians who are working and living here in the UK or in Europe or in Asia for that matter, but just the diaspora of Australia, living and working outside the country, are doing an incredibly good job, are on top of their game, frequently running very large companies, and you wouldn't know they were Australian, and you might happen to read their bio or something or other that tells you that, but it's not as obvious as you might think. And it never ceases to amaze me seeing that. I see it time and time and time and time again in places which is extraordinary. That they're running banks in Russia. Well, how the hell did they get to Russia? Like, where did that go? Where did that come from? On the cultural side, there was I think 30 odd years ago, Australians were pigeonholed a little bit, in the same way perhaps that the Brits were, but they were pigeonholed as kind of slightly raucous, a bit noisy blokes, whether they were women or men. It was kind of in that kind of category. And basically they have a good time because they've come from a country where it's a country where you simply have a good time. That's it. There's nothing else going on. So why would you go to Australia unless you're going to go there for a holiday? You wouldn't go there to work, because people go for a surf, then they do a bit of work, then they go for a surf. And that was a perception of Australians for quite a while. That perception has changed not only from the work perspective, it's now changed also on a cultural perspective, where every other movie, particularly movies, I guess, movie actor is Australian. It's extraordinary. It's the ones who are doing incredibly successfully. It's a disproportionate number of Australians. In sport, the disproportionate, for 20 million people, how do you produce consistently good cricketers, good tennis players, good swimmers, good football players, good, and so on? Like, it just goes, it's endless. New Zealand's similar in a sense, I guess, because there's only 3 million people. But how does that happen? And I think that's starting, or has started in the last 10 or 15 years, to change the way people perceive the culture of Australia. Taking the piss out of yourself is a very, very important part of Australian humour. And the self-effacing humour has always been part of our culture. It doesn't work in many countries, it works beautifully there. But it's kind of not really that serious. We're not really doing that. We're just sort of making light of a situation or whatever. And we're also, I guess, restating that humility, or taking some lesser read on a situation than is really perhaps necessary, or somebody else would take a more serious position. So I think that the Australian glass jaw idea is kind of like, you can't, if you said it really seriously, then that would be highly offensive. I think so to an Australian, that they would say, that's not fair, or they would defend it very strongly. And I know I would. I don't think it's anyone's been conned into that, but I think if you're, in my case, I've been living outside Australia for 12 years. I'll take the mickey out of myself, but I totally get it when people are fooling around, well, in a light-hearted, genuine sense about Australians. But if it became quite serious and personal, then I would get upset about that. And I think that if you could call it glass jaw, maybe, but I don't. I think it's defending something which is worth defending. I think this debate about schizophrenia, if you've got 2 passports, is nonsense. It's you're not in denial, and you can call 3 places home, as far as I can tell. Like Australia, I'm always Australian, but my home happens to be in London at the moment. And if we moved to France, then my home would be in France, in that sense. So I've integrated as best I can into the society and culture that I'm currently in, which happens to be in London. That doesn't mean that I've denied anything from Australia. And on the contrary, I've worked quite hard to make sure that my daughter here understands what it is to be Australian, even though she's not lived there yet, and hopefully she will at some point in time. I support Australia in other fashions, but more importantly, I'm not saying, well, I don't have a conflict having them both. That's probably the best way to describe it. It's got nothing to do with schizophrenia or bipolar or whatever. It's people, the world has changed. The world's changed dramatically. It was only after the First World War that anybody bothered having passports and they could travel anyway. So now my passport for living in England is somewhat convenient, pretty obviously. But the passport, or the citizenship that it affords me, is Irish, which is actually quite a cool passport to have, or citizenship to have. My grandfather immigrated from Ireland in 1917, so it's not that long ago that he was living and working in Ireland. And we do quite a lot of work in Ireland as well, so it's actually quite good fun. It's like having a holiday house in a sense. Look, I think guilt's not quite the right word, and maybe it's because I'm in denial. But I think that is there any guilt in having left Australia? No, realistically there's not. Is there a desire to do something for Australia? And this is not to compensate for something, but just the desire to do something? Yeah, absolutely. So I get involved in activities which are, at the end of the day, very good for Australia. That's not the same as living and working in Australia. In my case, the work that I do, it would be very hard for me to do that inside Australia. It's not that it's particularly English, but the stuff that we're doing it's easier to do it here. There's more crossovers with other people who are in opposite or similar activities. So I wouldn't be doing that same thing there. It's not like transplanting exactly. I think that you can do a lot for Australia, but not happen to be living there for sure. More and more people that I bump into, Australians that I bump into, you end up asking the question of each other, well, when are you going back, or how long you've been here, or whatever. And more people, like really a significant noticeable number of people are saying very sheepishly, I'm not going back, or I don't think I'm going back, or as opposed to what I think happened was, I'm going back in August next year when my visa runs out, or I'm going back because I want to go back, or whatever it is. And I think that's really interesting. It surprises me now that the exception is finding people who say, yeah, I'm going back in a year's time. And I have found them. I have found some people who just hated the experience here. They just didn't get it for whatever reason, but that's up to them. Majority of people now saying, I don't know if I am going back. In my case, I'm not going back. I'm lucky. I get to go back twice a year. Anyway, more or less every 6 months I'm back in Australia for 2 or 3 or 4 weeks. And that's partly work and partly family, because I've got all my family in Australia as well. And so I'm exceptional in that sense. How would it be if I was living here and hadn't been back for 5 years? I think that would be extremely difficult. And would it mean that I would want to go back permanently to live? It'd depend on my circumstances at the time, I guess. If their circumstances were the same as this, then no. I think I really do enjoy living here. It's fabulous. It's a great place to live. But the thing that did intrigue me is when I'm talking to people is why they're sheepish when they say, it's almost like they shouldn't say it, or hopefully their mum won't hear. It's like, where did that come from? It's okay. You can give yourself permission to stay here. It's not a problem.